Yá'át'ééh, my relatives. Hello, this is Mark Charles. Today is Wednesday, October 16th. I'm sitting here with my second cup of coffee. And there's a few things I want to talk about. Some events from yesterday on Indigenous Peoples Day I'd love to bring up. There's some stuff I've been reading about AI. And then I want to talk about some politics, both nationally and locally here in DC, and ending with a discussion on ranked choice voting and open primaries and who's opposed to that. So anyway, I invite you to grab a favorite cup of your morning beverage or your early afternoon beverage, depending on where you are. Here in DC, it's just a little bit afternoon, so I'm still drinking my second cup of coffee. But before I begin, let me do like I always do and acknowledge I'm speaking to you from Piscataway lands. The Piscataway, they're the nation that they were living here and fishing here, farming here and hunting here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they're still here. I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the land where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. Just want to state and even remind myself how humbling it is to be moving, living, breathing, eating, working on these lands today. So, Yá'át'ééh, my Piscataway relatives, thank you for your stewardship of these lands. Let me see who's on with me. I know there's a few people coming, but yeah, I'm not sure who's going to be able to join this morning or this early afternoon. Susan, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining. Glad you can have a cup of tea and join me for this discussion. As you can see, I'm kind of moving things around my studio. I moved my studio from, it was actually my bedroom upstairs, where it's been for a long time. And now we moved it to our basement. And my studio is in our basement. It gives me a little more room. It lets me separate a bit more from where I sleep and try to rest. And Maxine, Yá'át'ééh, thank you, Maxine, for joining this morning. It's great to see you. Glad you could join this morning. And Susan, already, I said good morning to you. Thank you for joining me and grabbing your cup of tea. It's great to have both of you with me. But so as I move my studio down to the basement, the color scheme is a bit different down here. The lighting's a bit different. And so it's I've had to make a few adjustments. I'm trying a few different things with the screen I have in the background, trying to find a good way to post some graphics and some videos up there. So anyway, yeah, that's what I'm working on right now and just making a few adjustments as I go on. I see Steve has joined. Steve, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining this morning. It's good to have you here. I want to share a few things, yes, about some events I did recently. So if you remember, obviously yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and I had an event that I was able to take part in. It was in the Adrian Dominican Sisters, which is a Catholic organization of sisters from really around the globe, but they were gathering. They had a gathering in Michigan, and they asked me to come and speak to them regarding some thoughts on Indigenous Peoples Day and the doctrine of discovery. And so they were there personally, but they were live streaming it, and so I joined them virtually. And that event was live streamed, and it's now posted on their website. And so I'm going to put this into the chat. If you would like to watch this video, you can join it here at the Dominican Sisters website. And it's their top video now, or their first video that is shown in their website. But I really enjoyed it. They seemed like they were really wrestling with some issues, not only with the doctrine of discovery and living here in the United States, but even with the Catholic Church and what it meant for the church to be engaged in some of these dialogues and conversations. And so at the end of my presentation, I gave about an hour and 15-minute presentation. And for the first hour or first 55 minutes to an hour, I spoke about the history of the doctrine of discovery, and many of you heard me talk about that. And then at the end, the last 20 minutes or so, I talked much more specifically about the role of the Catholic Church recently. And I especially addressed some of the things that Pope Francis has said both publicly and that he has been behind, including his remarks to a joint session of Congress back in 2015, the apology he gave to Native peoples regarding residential schools in 2022, and then, of course, the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery by the Vatican in 2023. And I discussed those much more directly at the end. And I actually it was really helpful and good to kind of go through that and bring those things together. And so anyway, I invite you to watch that. You can join that video. It was streamed live. My presentation starts about 10 minutes and 30 seconds in. They don't have a whole lot before that, some introductions and the land acknowledgement, which is important. And then I start speaking around 10 minutes and 30 seconds into the video. Deborah, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining this morning, Deborah. Good to see you on. Glad you could join this morning and join those of us who are gathering for a cup of coffee. But anyway, it's good to have people here. The second thing I wanted to let you know is a few weeks ago, I spoke at Denver Seminary in their Compelling and Credible Witness Conference regarding the church and politics. And there was myself and several other speakers there speaking that day. And they have that posted now on their YouTube channel. And so if you would like to see my presentation, you can watch it at the Denver Seminary YouTube channel. I just put the link into the chat right there. And if you want to see the entire conference, they have all 4 speakers plus the panel that we did posted onto their YouTube channel. And so I'm posting that there now too, where you can view that and watch that. Yeah, those are some videos of some things I've done more recently that you can watch and you can join and hear some of the things I've been able to discuss in some of these more recent events. Now I want to talk a little bit about just Indigenous Peoples Day. And if you've heard me talk in the past about Indigenous Peoples Day, you'll know there was a large push, and we're going back almost over a decade now, to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. And I was never the largest fan of, absolutely, I wanted to have an Indigenous Peoples Day. I think that's important, a day to celebrate the people who are indigenous to Turtle Island and our nations and our roles that we've played here. I absolutely am 100% in support of doing that. I was more hesitant about using that day to replace Columbus Day. And the reason is not that I want to honor Columbus and have some sort of nostalgic memory about Columbus. Absolutely not. But I think we need to make sure that we continue to remember who Columbus was and what he did and what he stood for. Absolutely, we do not need to celebrate him. But we also don't need to cancel him. We don't need to just write that out of our history. We need to remember and talk very directly about what he did, what his legacy was, and the role he had in creating the environment that we're wrestling with even today, hundreds of years later. And so I was never the biggest fan of putting Indigenous Peoples Day on Columbus Day. And over the years, I've done several different things on Indigenous Peoples Day. If you remember the start of my book, In Unsettling Truths, I actually went to a Columbus Day event in front of the Union Station here in Washington, D.C. And I don't know if I was part of a protest there, but I was there and said some words and kind of riled some people up a little bit. And in the past, I've spoken at different Indigenous Peoples Day events around the country. And this year I did something online. And yesterday, as I was both preparing for my event and thinking about Indigenous Peoples Day, one of the things that I have been really wanting to do more recently, and I've especially noticing it in this past year, as I've been invited to speak on topics that extend beyond the doctrine of discovery. right? I was invited to speak on the church and politics at Denver Seminary. I was invited to speak on concepts of home at the CCDA. I spoke on issues of decolonizing health at um, uh, um, the Good Medicine Way gathering a couple weeks ago in Albuquerque. And I was invited to talk about the Lewis and Clark Trail by the National Park Service a few months ago. And I've been asked to speak about some things that kind of go beyond just the doctrine of discovery. And I'm going actually in November, I'm going next month down to Alabama, and I'm speaking to some medical, nursing, and public health students in Birmingham, Alabama. And I'm talking about the doctrine of discovery, but also about Indian healthcare, as well as indigenous understandings of health and what we've done over the centuries and thousands of years to be healthy in these lands. And so, as I'm getting the opportunity to talk more about the history, or more about things beyond just the doctrine of discovery, I'm really enjoying taking the conversation to new places and discussing some different things. The biggest challenges, and you saw this most clearly if you were at my event at CCDA, the plenary talk I gave. Well, actually not there. It was, you saw it more closely at Denver Seminary, where I really had to teach the history first, because people don't know the history. And if you don't know the history, you won't understand my take on the church and politics. If you don't know about the doctrine of discovery, you won't understand my take on indigenous health. If you don't know these things, right, you understand how how it's going to influence these conversations that happen later. And as I was preparing for my talk yesterday, I realized I like discussing the doctrine of discovery. I like creating that common memory, but I also really like the idea of just going in a new direction or talking about new things, and especially talking about the incredible contributions of Indigenous peoples and ways that we can absolutely be not just helpful, but transformative in the progress of this, not only this country, but the lands that we're living on. And I realized, I'm like, yeah, I don't like having a day where you have we still call it Columbus Day, right? We still celebrate Columbus Day, and it's Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's so striking that we live in a nation that is seeking to honor one of the people who committed genocide against Native peoples on the same day that we're honoring and remembering Native peoples, right? We're trying to play both sides of the coin here. And I realized I really don't like that. So in the future, I'm not sure how I'm going to address that. If I'm going to do something on Columbus Day that is specific only to teaching the history and addressing those things, and then do something on a different day, even the day before, the day after, that talks really more in depth about the contributions and the wisdom and the culture and the people of Turtle Island and those who are indigenous to these lands, as a way to really kind of celebrate that without having to deal with the political and the social battles that we have to deal with as we're trying to teach these things and talk about these things on a day where half the country is still trying to acknowledge one of the people who is committing genocide against us. So anyway, I'm thinking about that, and I may take a different approach to this day next year. I'll obviously let you know what I'm going to be doing, but those are just a few thoughts I have about what we need to do for Columbus Day. I also just wanted to share an article with you. My father actually read this article and kind of told me about it, and then I looked it up this morning. It ran in Indian Country Today. I think it ran on Monday, on Indigenous Peoples Day. And the name of the article, it's kind of an op-ed. It's called Spanish Colonizers Accept Our King, Our God, or Else. And it talks about something that was written by the King of Spain, that was given to the explorers and the colonizers in the early 1500s. And it was translated as the requirement. It's basically something they had to go out and read to the people they were colonizing, to the native nations, basically saying, accept our rule or else we're gonna kill you, and you're going to be solely responsible for our death, for your own deaths, and you're going to be, we have the God on our side. Basically, it was this thing that they read in Latin, actually, I think it was. Not even obviously in our own languages. So Native peoples had no clue what they were even saying half the time as they were reading this document to us. And it was basically threatening us with death if we didn't just blanketly accept the rule of these peoples who just happen to land on the continent we're living on. And I haven't done a lot of research into this article. This is the first time I've actually heard about it. And so I'm sharing the article here. I invite you to read it. I actually went through, they have a link to the requiremento, I think is what it's called, the translated document. I did read that as well. And the thing it made me think about is some stuff I was researching over the summer when I was talking about Lewis and Clark, where at the beginning of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the movement of the Corps of Engineer or the Corps of Discovery, that they were going west of Mississippi and going into that kind of these uncharted lands, foreign territory, as those lands were discovered by France. And Lewis and Clark were going out there, and their message that they were bringing from President Thomas Jefferson was, we will be better partners and better trade allies and better allies with you than the French or the Spanish will be. And so you might want to think about creating closer ties with us, the United States of America. Very much almost an appeal of, we want to be your peers, we want to be partners with you, we want to be allies with you and trading partners with you. And then just a few days before the expedition left, the Corps of Discovery left, we completed the Louisiana Purchase. And now all of the lands where Lewis and Clark were going weren't foreign territory. They now belong to the United States. And so Jefferson quickly got a new message out to Lewis and Clark, and their new message to the native peoples west of the Mississippi was, you have a new great white father, and it will be, you will be wise to basically submit to him. Which is not that different than this requirement thing, right? That Spanish came here to read. I'm like, oh, we made a purchase, we bought your land, you're now you now belong to the United States of America, and we are your overlords, and you better listen to us and submit to us, and blah blah blah. And of course, he wasn't lying, right? I mean, within a few decades of that expedition, the U.S. Army literally had gone through and ethnically cleansed a lot of those nations and a lot of those lands as they were trying to complete Manifest Destiny. It's mind-boggling how many of the specific tribes Lewis and Clark met, and tribes that literally kept Lewis and Clark alive during their expedition, were later massacred and forcibly removed from their lands by the same government that Lewis and Clark represented. And so when I read the requirement, it actually made me think about how Thomas Jefferson changed his message to the native nations west of the Mississippi after they completed the Louisiana Purchase. So anyway, I invite you to read that. The third article I wanted just to share with you that I've been reading, this caught my eye this morning. I don't have a lot of thoughts on it, but a few months ago, I read an article, maybe a month and a half ago, and we all know that AI has been really kind of causing quite a stir. Not just nationally, but globally. And there's almost a race of corporations and of companies to open their doors to AI. No one wants to get left behind. Everyone wants to kind of control this new virtual power that's being constructed. And I read an article a few months ago about how much water is needed to cool these data centers that run these AI computers. And because AI requires so much more processing power than search, right? The one of the articles I read said like a former data center, a previous generation of data centers might use about 10 megawatts of power, and an AI data center could easily use up to 100 megawatts of power. I think that's annually. Right. So because of the really high-end processing chips they have and the number of computers they're putting in these data centers, it consumes a lot of power. Excuse me, a lot of power. And so as companies like Google and OpenAI and Microsoft and Amazon are really investing heavily and racing to lead the global charge into artificial intelligence, this is having a huge impact on electricity needs. And I saw this article this morning in the Guardian, or yes, this morning actually, I was reading it in the Guardian after I woke up, drinking my first cup of coffee. And it talked about how Google is actually investing in small reactor nuclear power generation as a way to cleanly fuel some of their AI initiatives. And the article kind of looks at both sides, right? Maybe on one hand is Google being a responsible corporate citizen and trying to deal with this massive new amount of power consumption by doing something that is cleaner than coal burning or other fossil fuel burning, by doing something like investing in nuclear power. And then on the flip side, it's like, well, or are they just kind of, flouting their own dominance in the marketplace and on a global level by basically bypassing the whole political debate and just investing as a corporation into nuclear power generation through lobbying and so on and so forth, as a way to feed their consumption, their energy consumption needs. And it's an interesting debate, right? I did some more research on it. As you know, I don't like to just go with the first article I always find. And so I did some more research, and I found this article on AP that talks about how Amazon is now joining this race of investing in nuclear power to try and fuel their AI need and consumption. And yeah, I think I forget when I read the article a few months ago about the use of water to cool these data centers. It talked about how much greater power is required for a single AI query as compared to just a simple Google search. I forget the exact breakdown, but the amount of power that's needed to answer a single query to an AI is much greater than the amount of power that's needed to return the results from a simple Google query in a search phrase. And so you can't even help but use AI a lot of times. Even if you just do a plain Google search now, you will get at the top of your search an AI response to your search, giving you some language and some wording about your search and answering your question that was generated by an AI. And so, I think this is a debate that is definitely going to have to become much more front and center in not just our nation, but at a global level. Because many of these corporations, whether it's Google or Microsoft, right, these are multinational corporations that have deep investments in countries all around the world. And if they don't get permission from one country, they'll just go to another country and try to get permission there to do the things they want to do. And so, I think this raised a very interesting, even I guess, ethical question about what do we think about these corporations now investing money and becoming, kind of leaders in this, not only in AI, but in things like nuclear power generation, and taking a much more proactive role in that entire debate. So I welcome you to read those articles. I don't have a specific thought on them right now, but these are definitely some things I'm going to be pondering and thinking about over these next few weeks and months, and probably even years, because I think these are going to be some important questions we really need to wrestle with. Hola, Deji. Hey, good morning. Good to see you. Thanks for joining. I'm glad you could join this morning. It's great to have you as well as many other people who are on this uh, podcast with me, enjoying my second cup of coffee. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and I have a few articles here I wanted to share with you, is regarding the 2024 election. And there was an op-ed that I read this morning in the New York Times that I wanted to share with you. And it's talking about the rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign, specifically out of Donald Trump, with his threats to his political opponents and people who he's now calling the enemy within. Not being absolutely specific about who he's addressing, but talking about it in the context of his political enemies and that he's going to be seeking retribution. And right, just seeming to be elevating the dialogue. And this article points out he's talking in a way that no candidate, let alone a former president, has ever spoken in regards to using our military for political retribution and political payback and things like that. And if you read the article, as again, it's the New York Times, it's left leaning, it is trying to paint Trump generally in a negative light, and I don't agree. I don't disagree. Right, this is absolutely some negative behavior by him. So the whole first half of the article talks about all these things that he's saying, and how divisive and explosive it is, and he highlights all these quotes. And one of them that they highlight says, just as rhetoric from I think a few days ago, it says they are all so bad and frankly they're evil. Mr. Trump said they're evil. What they've done, they weaponized our elections. They've done things that nobody thought was even possible. And right, there are quoting Donald Trump, and he does speak that way. And I absolutely agree. This is alarming and concerning. In the middle of the article, the second half of the article, one of the paragraphs begins and says, such threats of vengeance from Mr. Trump are hardly new. He has been talking about punishing his political adversaries since his 2016 run, when he repeatedly insisted that his opponent, Hillary Clinton, should go to jail and even encouraged crowds to chant, "Lock her up," at his rallies. Since his defeat in 2020, he has refused to accept that result, continuing to peddle false claims about election fraud. And so, while the article highlights some more recent comments by Donald Trump, again, which are alarming and which need to be addressed, but I think we also have to remember this isn't new for Donald Trump, right? He has been talking this way since he entered the political stage almost a decade ago, right? And so on one hand, yes, we need to understand what is being talked about and what's at stake. On the other hand, they're writing about it like this has all happened just recently and this is horrible and what do we need to do about it? And instead of realizing, yeah, this is the way this guy speaks and this is the way he operates. And so I'm not trying to minimize the impact of his words. But I do want to make sure, right, as we get closer and closer to the elections, not just is Donald Trump going to begin using much more inflammatory language, which he is doing, but the Democrats are going to also be highlighting things he says and capitalize on anything that he says to make it even more alarming. And again, most of our media leans to the left. And so that's what we're going to hear about most of the time. Now, I'm not saying go watch Fox News, but I am saying if you're going to read an article, especially by one of these left-leaning news sources like the New York Times or like CNN or like MSNBC, read the entire article. Because, yeah, the first few paragraphs are going to inflame you, but maybe towards the middle, they'll do some actual better journalism and talk about the broader story and the bigger picture. But I want to make sure that we don't get sucked into this very combative, very binary view of politics and of political opponents that is only going to exacerbate the problems that already exist. And I don't disagree. Problems do exist. The language Donald Trump uses is absolutely alarming, but also the way that the left frames the argument is also very alarming. If you heard me a few months ago when Joe Biden dropped out of the race and Kamala Harris stepped in, and then when she picked Tim Walz and he began referring Trump as someone who was weird instead of as someone who was a threat to our democracy, I actually really welcomed that language because it was actually humanizing Trump instead of painting him as this boogeyman who's just out there to destroy everything. And I think it put him in his place, and it played a little less to his ego and to his narcissism and all the other things that Trump absolutely appears to be struggling with. But now it seems like the Democrats are ramping up that same rhetoric that Joe Biden found so useful in his campaign, both in 2020 as well as in 2016, which is to frame Trump as the enemy of democracy. And again, I'm not defending Trump, but I'm saying we have to recognize both sides are amping up this rhetoric. And I want to make sure that we're not having our emotions played with, not just by Donald Trump, who is being demonstrated is using emotion and anger and threats to elevate his voice and make sure that he's heard and he's in the center of the room. But as we get closer to the election, the Democrats are going to be amping that up as well and painting an even bleaker picture, again, so that hopefully their candidate will be elected and Donald Trump will not be elected. And to help you understand this a little bit, I want to talk about local politics here in DC. Right? Local politics is so interesting in Washington, D.C. because we hardly have a vote here, right? We don't have a senator. We don't have Congress members. We have a senator who sits there, but they can't vote on anything. And so there's no real political power there. I think we have one vote in the Electoral College, right? And so we are not represented well. When I lived on the Navajo Nation, right, this is the largest reservation in the nation, 26,000 square miles. If we were a state, we'd be the 40th largest state, larger than 9 other states in this country. 300,000 plus enrolled tribal members. But because we sit in the Four Corners area, with lands in both Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, we don't have a single voting block in any of those states. We don't make up a single congressional district in any of those states. And so our voice as a nation, as in the Navajo Nation, as Navajo people, has been diminished because our votes are going to 3 different votes in the Electoral College, and we can't actually vote as a unified group of people. And if you remember, back in 2012, I think it was, I was living on the Navajo Nation, watching very closely the campaign that year between President Obama and John McCain, and lamenting how no one was taking time to campaign directly to Native nations and Native peoples. And so I've lived a lot of my life, especially my adult life, in places that are incredibly marginalized politically, where you don't even really have a vote to represent the people you're living among, right? Here in DC, we hardly have a vote here. On the Navajo Nation, we hardly had a vote living there. And so when I ran for president in 2020, I ran as an independent. And the book I co-authored with Sing-Chan Ra on Selling Truths, my lectures, I make a very strong bipartisan critique about the way both parties uphold these colonial values, right? Whether it's the myth of American exceptionalism, whether it's pleading and campaigning to white landowning men from both sides of the aisle, whether it's the notion of Christian nationalism. And I pointed out numerous times how Joe Biden is every bit the Christian nationalist that Donald Trump is. Right? These are bipartisan values, right? We live in a nation that's never abolished slavery. It's just been codified and constitutionally protected in the 13th Amendment, right? We have deep, deep, deep foundational level problems. And one of our problems is our two-party system, which paints every debate binary and offers increasingly over time, the only solution is just to vote the other party out of office so that the right party can come in and make the changes that need to be made. That's literally, so when you're out of power, all you do is obstruct, and when you're in power, all you do is ram things down the throat of the other half of the nation. And both parties play these games, right? You've heard me talk about how Republicans, right, they're much more explicitly racist, sexist, and white supremacists. They know they're not growing their appeal, especially among women and people of color. And so they're working hard to prevent people from voting, right? They're working hard to make it harder to register to vote. They're making it harder to vote by mail or to vote absentee, right? The less people that vote, the more likely it is a Republican candidate will be elected. The Democrats, on the other hand, they want as many people as possible to vote. They just want to limit the number of people that you can vote for. So it's Democrats that are suing to remove third-party and independent candidates from ballots. It's Democrats who are making things hard for other parties to join the race, right? And because the Democrats, they have a much more diverse base because they're more inclusive in some of their messaging. But 9 times out of 10, right, they nominate the most status quo, mediocre, white landowning male from the upper echelons of the 1% that they can find. And I know you're going to say, oh, but we had President Obama and we have now Kamala Harris, right? Yes, you do. But look at Harris's change from when she ran for president in 2020, where she was against drilling, she was against fracking, she had a much stronger stance on what's going on in the Middle East. And now that she's running after 4 years of what I assume is very deep mentoring by President Joe Biden, she supports fracking, she supports drilling, and she supports Israel. And she said, my policies have changed, but my values haven't. Right? President Obama came into office challenging the notion of American exceptionalism and left office after being soundly rebuked by both Democrats and Republicans, singing the songs, praising the myths of American exceptionalism better than almost any other president in history. So much his biography after he got out of office was titled what? A Promised Land. And so even when Democrats do nominate and put people of color on their ballot, they make absolutely sure they are safe and not an overt threat to white landowning men. Because they understand that's still where the bulk of political power exists in this country. Now, when you move and operate in independent third-party circles, and even in some liberal left-leaning circles, there's a lot of discussion about ranked choice voting and open primaries, right? The ability to let all citizens choose who's going to run for office. The ability to actually not only have a binary choice vote in your ballot when you vote in November. So ranked choice voting and open primaries are good options and have a lot of benefits to really trying to deal with the challenges we face as a nation, because we have an incredibly simplistic, and I would even argue elementary political system, which is this two-party system, which makes every discussion binary. And I know when I ran for president in 2020, some of the people who supported my work, they were the most adamant when I actually was running in the general, and they said, Mark, I cannot support you. I cannot vote for you because voting for you is like voting for Trump, and I refuse to do that. And so in this election here in DC, we have a ballot, our initiative on our ballot to approve ranked choice voting and open primaries. Apparently there's 76,000 independent voters in DC. And there's a move in our ballot, an initiative in our ballot for this upcoming election to approve ranked choice voting and open primaries. I just put an article in the chat about that. I'm going to put another one in from the Washington Post. And you'll never guess who's opposed to this. The Democratic Party. The DC Democratic Party. Their official stance is they are opposed to approving ranked choice voting and open primaries. DC in the last several, as long as I lived here, has voted 90%, if not higher, for Democratic candidates. Right? And one of their oppositions for opposing ranked choice voting is it's gonna muddle, or it's gonna reduce the influence of the Democratic Party in the district. I want you to understand, I'm not advocating for Republicans. I'm not doing that whatsoever. They have their own vile policies and the things that they're doing, which absolutely need to be opposed. But if we're going to play this game, well, then we can't pretend that the Democrats are always the good guys here. The Democrats are actively diminishing the voice of people of color here in the District of Columbia by opposing our ability to approve a common sense initiative like ranked choice voting and open primaries. And so we need to stop pretending like Donald Trump and the Republicans are the only threat to democracy in this land. They aren't. The Democratic Party is also an extreme threat to democracy in this land. And I get so sick of the good cop, bad cop, binary, simplistic, childlike dialogue that these two parties have every single time we get to a presidential election. It's like listening to two 2-year-olds scream at each other. Year after year after year after year after year, like they never mature. They never grow up. And in fact, they digress the longer they play this game and stay in these roles. It's at times it's maddening. And so as we come into these last few weeks of this 2024 election cycle, I just want to make sure we have our eyes open. I'm not yet telling you who to vote for and who not to vote for. I'm not campaigning for any candidate. I am merely trying to point out we have some deep, deep problems in this nation, and I can promise you, the Democrats are just as uninterested as the Republicans are in solving many of those problems. They really are. And if you don't understand the deeper picture, and if you don't look more at the foundational issues, you're going to easily buy into one of their simplistic binary arguments that they're going to make year after year after year, and we're never going to get the change we need as a nation. So I encourage you to continue paying attention to what's going on politically. I encourage you to be well educated, to be well informed, to read more than just what comes across your live stream or your algorithms in your social media. Learn how to hunt your news instead of being fed your news. Go to places that offer a bit more less bias and read from outlets on both sides of the aisle. See what both parties are talking about and trying to lay out. We need to make good decisions, but we also need to make sure we don't get played by this overly simplistic two-party system that on both sides is largely controlled by white landowning men. My relatives, I hope these things are helpful to you. There's a lot of work to be done in these next few weeks. There's a lot of work to be done. And I encourage you to stay educated, keep your eyes open. Don't work hard not to exacerbate the screaming and the yelling and the demonizing of both sides. And let's try to have a real honest discussion about our country, about the problems that we're facing, and about the best ways to solve those problems and move forward in a more productive path. If you like the work I'm doing, my relatives, I encourage you to help me keep my voice independent. One of the reasons I can say the things I say is because I'm not funded by a large institution. I don't have a job with a major corporation. I don't have an employer who tells me what I can and cannot say. I've worked very hard over the past few decades to keep my voice independent. I don't even monetize most of my social media because I don't want advertisers to influence what I say and don't say. One of the ways I am trying to earn money off my social media is through my Patreon site. On Patreon, you can subscribe to different tiers, and different tiers have different benefits. And at every level of my Patreon, I'm trying to bring the dialogue deeper and to try to find better and more ways to engage with people who support the work I'm trying to do. And if you like the work I'm doing and you want to help me keep my voice independent, I encourage you, even if just for a month, subscribe to my Patreon site. And it's a great way to go deeper in the dialogue as well as to support the work that I'm doing. The other thing that you can do, again, every speaking event I give, I have to start by educating people on the doctrine of discovery. There are so few people who truly understand this history. And I just had a discussion with my publisher the other day. They're still very pleased with how well the book is selling. It's still selling thousands of books a year. But it's nowhere near a national dialogue. It's nowhere near been like a national bestseller. And so I think we've sold around 25 to 30,000 copies, I think, so far, maybe just over 30,000. I don't have the exact number recently. But I'm still doing everything I can to get as many people as I can to read this book. And one of the ways I do that is I offer what's called my book study special, where if you want to run a book study and invite people to come and study on selling truths, if you buy 10 signed copies from my website, I will give your book study a 45-minute virtual Q&A where we can schedule something over the next year. Whenever you run your book study, you can schedule it with my assistant, and I'll jump on a Zoom call and we'll do a virtual Q&A with your study where they can ask questions directly of me regarding the book. It's a great way to kind of not only get people discussing these conversations or this content, but I love the discussions that happen in these Q&As. I have several of them a month, and I really, really enjoy the dialogue that gets generated by them. So I welcome you to do that and to join me. Or to help me get more people reading this book. And even if, like, I'm offering this now even to colleges and universities and Sunday school classes, right? If you have a local college that you know is reading our book, I just offered it to 2 colleges in the past couple weeks where I found out professors were using our book in their class. And I said, hey, if you buy the books from my website and you buy more than 10 of them, I will give your class a free virtual Q&A. And both times the professors were really excited about that idea. And so, yeah, I'm doing everything I can to try and get more people to engage with the dialogue, because we have to teach this history. If we want the conversation to progress further, it's not just about teaching the history and creating the common memory. It's about doing those things so we can bring the conversation even further. My relatives, I deeply appreciate all of you. I hope your second cup of coffee is as good as mine is. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. I'm going to be traveling with my family. We're taking our daughter to go visit a few colleges up in New York these next few days. And so my daughter is a senior in high school and is looking at a lot of colleges around the country. And so we're going to go visit a few this weekend and just take some time to get away for a few days as a family. I've been traveling a lot these past few weeks. So I'll absolutely be back next week on my second cup of coffee, and look forward to the conversation we're going to have as we get closer and closer to this upcoming election. Yá'át'ééh, my relatives, walk in beauty, and may we all learn how to walk in this beauty together. Yá'át'ééh, and Hako'onet.